So we're going to start off by looking really at the anterior pituitary hormones. So there are lots of sensory inputs that are coming in from our environment, and these are transferred via the central nervous system to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus then stimulates the release of releasing and inhibiting hormones. So we get this stimulatory or inhibitory process coming into our neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. This information is then transferred down to the anterior pituitary and also the posterior pituitary, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. This information is transferred down to the anterior pituitary by the release of hormones from the hypothalamus, which enter the portal blood vessels, come down to the anterior pituitary, and bind to specific receptors on specific cells. And then we can go on to release a variety of hormones. So from the anterior pituitary, we may release FSH and LH, so follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, leading to the stimulation of the testes and ovaries. You may get thyroid stimulating hormone going on to stimulate the thyroid gland. You may get the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone going on to stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. Prolactin may target the mammary glands to obviously stimulate milk synthesis. You've got melanite stimulating hormone for stimulating your melanocytes, and then growth hormone for stimulating the liver, bones, and other tissues involved in growth. So all of these hormones, growth hormone, MSH, prolactin, ACTH, TSH, FSH, and LH, are all being stimulated or inhibited because of the hormones that are being released from the hypothalamus into the portal blood vessels. And these in turn are being stimulated by a variety of sensory inputs from the environment. So whether that's the external or the internal environment. And we have to have endocrine feedback in place. So our sensory receptors often gather that external internal environment. It's integrated by neurons of the central nervous system, and we start to produce a hormone. And negative feedback loops are quite common in animals to ensure that not too much of a hormone is released. So if we just take a really crude picture looking at this, we get lots of stimuli coming in at the level of the central nervous system and acting on the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus goes on to release a hypothalamic hormone, doesn't matter what it is at this stage. That will generally stimulate the anterior pituitary to lead to the release of an anterior pituitary hormone. Then that anterior pituitary hormone will then bind to a peripheral endocrine gland and stimulate whatever its particular target is. But this peripheral gland hormone that is eventually released has negative feedback on both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So the more of this gland that is produced, this hormone that is produced, the more negative feedback you get on the anterior pituitary, the more negative feedback you get on the hypothalamus to inhibit the release of these hormones, to make sure you stay within an ideal homeostatic balanced range. The anterior pituitary hormone may also inhibit hormones being released from the hypothalamus. Again, another part of that negative feedback to ensure that we don't produce too much of any one hormone, which can potentially go on to have adverse effects. So therefore, looking at this, you can ensure that the nervous system and the endocrine system are very tightly regulated and integrated together. So looking at where is this hypothalamic pituitary axis? So you can see the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So remember, the hypothalamus is a key part of the central nervous system. It's also involved in the limbic system, which is to do with our emotional centers. And it has a variety of other centers in there as well. And it talks with the pituitary gland. So it receives lots and lots of information and talks with the pituitary gland via the pituitary stalk. So just a little joining point. And if we move over to this little image on the right, again, you can see the hypothalamus talking down to the pituitary gland via the pituitary stalk. And again, taking another look at the diagram, you can see this. It's in the center. So the pituitary sits just behind the nose, if you want to think of it like that. And the optic chiasm, this is where the optic nerves cross. And so the pituitary gland lies inferior to the hypothalamus with the optic chiasm in between. So if someone were to get a pituitary tumor, for example, that can compress on the optic chiasm, leading to visual field defects. An example would be loss of peripheral vision, is one of the features that someone gets if you get too large a pituitary tumor, compressing that optic chiasm. So again, when we're looking, this is a very similar diagram to what we've shown before. We've got the hypothalamus receiving, which is part of our central nervous system, receiving lots of signals coming in. And the anterior, it's connected to the anterior pituitary via portal blood vessels. So this is the anterior pituitary on the left-hand side of this diagram. And so what you can see is the hypothalamus is receiving information. It then makes and secretes a neurohormone, because it's been made in a nerve cell, releases a neurohormone into the portal blood system, portal blood vessels, which pass down through the pituitary stalk to the anterior pituitary, where they go on to stimulate the release of another hormone. In contrast to this, then at the level of the posterior pituitary, again, you make a neurohormone in the hypothalamus. But in this case, the neurohormones are transported through the pituitary stalk along the axons to the end of the nerve cell, where they are stored in preparation to be released directly into the posterior pituitary and therefore into the blood system. So in other words, at the level of the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus produces a hormone, enters the blood vessels, goes to the anterior pituitary, another hormone is released. With the posterior pituitary, a hormone is made in the hypothalamus, is transported to the posterior pituitary, where it is directly released into the bloodstream. So one hormone thinking about the posterior pituitary, a two hormone axis if we're thinking about the anterior pituitary. It is very important to note that not all of our endocrine glands are controlled by the pituitary. So what are the two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary? Well, one of them is obviously oxytocin, and this helps to control milk release from a lactating breast, but it's also involved in uterine contraction at the onset of labor. It's also called the feel-good hormone, so it improves your mood, and there are lots of other functions of oxytocin that we'll talk about at a later time. And we also have antidiuretic hormone, also called AVP or vasopressin, and this acts on the kidneys to reabsorb water. So it's released in response to an increase in plasma osmolarity through the where it's detected in the hypothalamic osmoreceptors, and it's also seen in severe blood volume depletion. So how does ADH work? Well, if you have an increase in your plasma osmolarity, which is the primary cause of ADH release, this is detected by the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. This leads to the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary, because remember, it's made in the hypothalamus and it's transported to the posterior pituitary, where it's released from the posterior pituitary into the blood system, then acts on the kidneys to selectively reabsorb water in the distal tubule and collecting ducts, which dilutes our blood, so in other words, decreases our plasma osmolarity, which brings us back into homeostasis. So a couple of review questions. Press pause, have a read, and then unpress pause. Which of the following are correct regarding the structure of the pituitary and hypothalamus? The pituitary is located superior to the hypothalamus. That's false. It is inferior to the hypothalamus. The optic nerves generally cross inferior to the pituitary. That is also false. It's superior to the pituitary. The posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus via portal blood vessels. That is also incorrect. Posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus via its neurons. The axon runs all the way down the pituitary stalk. Portal blood vessels connect two capillary beds together. That is correct. Second question. The posterior pituitary stores anterior pituitary hormones which are released into the blood upon hypothalamic stimulation. That's incorrect. Number 2. Receives hormones from neurons through the pituitary stalk. That is correct. Number 3. Synthesizes and secretes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. That is incorrect. The hypothalamus synthesizes ADH and oxytocin. They are released from the posterior pituitary into the blood supply. Number 4 is composed of nerve tissue or nervous tissue. That is correct. The last little bit I'd like you to do is just think about what you already know about a variety of hormones. So here are some of the key hormones that we'll be talking about over the next few sessions. I just want you to think, what are the main functions of each of these hormones? So please press pause at this stage have a think about each one, and then we'll go through the main functions. By no means all of the functions, just some of the main ones that you should be thinking about. Growth hormone. Growth, it also increases blood glucose. Testosterone, protein synthesis, sperm production, sex drive, secondary sexual characteristics. There are all kinds of things that testosterone stimulates. Estrogen and progesterone. Egg maturation, secondary sexual characteristics, if we're thinking about estrogen. Progesterone prepares the uterus for a fertilized egg. Plenty of other functions also. Thyroxine increases your metabolic rate and therefore increases your temperature. Adrenaline is part of your fight or flight response, so increases cardiac output, increases blood glucose levels, amongst other things. Cortisol is your long-term stress hormone, so it increases your blood glucose levels, again, amongst many other functions. So it's a regulator of your inflammatory and immune responses, for example. Glucagon increases your blood glucose levels, amongst other things. Insulin decreases blood glucose levels, involved in lipid, protein, and glycogen synthesis, so storage of energy, in other words. Aldosterone, sodium reabsorption, so water follows, so via the kidneys, so it's involved in blood volume and pressure regulation. Also, the other very important function of aldosterone is potassium excretion via the kidneys. Antidiuretic hormone, water reabsorption, so primarily involved in regulating blood osmolarity, but also involved in volume regulation, in particular if you have severe volume depletion. Parathyroid hormone and vitamin D are both involved in calcium homeostasis.